Cleethorpes. Today it is home to nearly 40,000 people, but in the early 1850s there were less than 1,000 inhabitants living here in just a couple of hundred houses. Even before the railway finally made it to Cleethorpes in 1863, it was already a popular destination for visitors, especially from Yorkshire, Nottinghamshire and other parts of Lincolnshire, with the equivalent of today's population of Cleethorpes descending on the resort each season to enjoy the plentiful supplies of fresh fish and seafood, the sea bathing, cliff walks and pleasure grounds. I'm here at Ross Castle in this edition of Turning Back the Tide. We're going back to August 1854. It was the height of the holiday season, with 1,500 visitors crammed into a handful of hotels and 100 or so lodging houses. A tragedy began to unfold in the Cleethorpes area just behind me. By the end of it, around 5% of the population of Cleethorpes were dead, along with roughly 1% of the visitors. What caused this shocking loss of life? The answer to that was very unwelcome and virulent visitor that went by the name of cholera. Hello and welcome to Turning Back the Tide with me, your host, Piers Conservation. This series was originally conceived for television, but budget cuts mean that we're here on the radio. But on the bright side, you can't see the massive grease stain from my fish and chip lunch on my tie. The 1854 outbreak of cholera in Cleethorpes has now become little more than a footnote in the history of the town, with only a plaque in Wardle Street to remind passers-by that it ever happened. Such was the terrible speed with which the cholera struck, no one is entirely sure how many people died or indeed who some of them were. Until now, little has been written about the people who lost their lives in August and September of 1854. But history is the people who make it, and the Turning Back the Tide team, such as they are, have delved into the archives and pieced together the stories of some of the victims, heroes and villains involved in this tragic tale. But first, what is cholera? Joining me in our 1854 studio is Mr. Hilliard Marshall Leppington, Surgeon and Union Medical Officer for Grimsby. Mr. Leppington, could you please describe the symptoms of cholera for us?
Certainly. The first signs are giddiness, sick stomach, nervous agitation, slow pulse and cramps, which begin in the fingers and toes and spread throughout the body. The next stage is the vomiting and purging of a liquid like rice water or whey. The features become sharp and contracted, the eyes sink, and the victim takes on an expression of terror, with her skin assuming a blue, purple, black or brown tint. Depending on the intensity of the attack, their fingers and toes shrivel, their skin becomes deadly cold and damp, their tongue like a piece of dead flesh. They cannot speak and struggle for breath, and there are often rigid spasms. Is that enough? I can go on.
No, I think we get the picture. Could you tell us what the treatment was for cholera at the time of the outbreak?
Well, if the newspaper advertisements were to be believed, there were various drops, elixirs and tinctures that would not just ease the early symptoms of cholera, but actually cure it. But would you rely on something made from vegetables that you could buy from Skelton's the booksellers? I think not. Certainly, it would be vitally important to seek medical attention at the first sign of diarrhea or loosening of the bowels, as the greatest chance of recovery came if caught early. After that, the treatments became more desperate and less likely to succeed.
Really?
Oh yes. Patients had their legs plunged into near boiling water, veins opened and bled, chicken tea enemas administered. It was more likely to kill a cholera patient in an already weakened state than cure.
Blimey, thank God for the NHS!
The what?
Never mind. So, what do you consider to be the best way to tackle cholera, Mr. Leppington?
Prevention, without a shadow of a doubt. By the time someone's been laid low by cholera, it's often already too late. What's needed are clean water, supplies, and plenty of them. Proper drainage, streets free of livestock, human waste and slaughterhouse offal. An end to overcrowding in houses. In this case, my recommendations had been ignored, and it was too late for prevention. So I did my best to stem the further spread of the disease by ordering tar barrels to be burned in the streets, and used a water cart borrowed from Grimsby to drench the streets of the chloride of lime during the night. We also established a cholera depot in the town, staffed night and day in relays of medical men brought in from other places, since Cleethorpes had none of its own.
Cleethorpes had no doctor?
No, it's not uncommon for a small town like Cleethorpes to have no medical men living there. In the 1830s, during the bathing season, I began to visit Cleethorpes twice a week on a Monday and a Thursday between 12 and 4. I would see both visitors and residents at the Mr. Anderson's house and make house calls if requested. But it wasn't deemed necessary for a surgeon to reside permanently in the town, as there were a number of us who could be sent for from Grimsby.
Thank you, Mr. Leppington. You've been most helpful.
My pleasure.
So it's clear from what Mr. Leppington said that Cleethorpes wasn't the cleanest of places in 1854. In fact, it was described as being in a most insanitary condition, being full of overcharged cesspools, foul dustbins, filthy pigsties, and stagnant open ditches. I doubt we'd been awarded a blue flag back then. One man who visited Cleethorpes shortly before the cholera outbreak was James Hitchens, coroner and auctioneer from Lincoln, who wrote to the papers about the accident waiting to happen that was Cleethorpes. He joins us now in the 1854 studio. Welcome, Mr. Hitchens. Perhaps you could tell us what you witnessed when you visited Cleethorpes.
Certainly, sir. As I walked from the Dolphins to the Sands on the evening of my arrival, I was assailed by a miasmatous matter that seemed to have poisoned the air, and which proceeded from a noxious standing drain running across the sand, over which the visitors and inhabitants had to pass, and alongside of which is the high path for visitors to take the benefit of the air. Passing from this to the High Thorpes and inspecting the outskirts, I found sufficient to justify me, without wishing to be thought a prophet of evil, to warn those I knew and openly to foretell the certainty of cholera being shortly among them as an unwelcome visitor.
So you warned the local people?
Indeed I did, sir. I particularly pointed out the drain to which I have referred as most nasally offensive and dangerous to the respiratory organs. It was my theme for the 3 days I was there, and it will be recollected by some of the respectable inhabitants who were assembled to spend an evening at the Dolphins, that I strongly called their attention to the existing nuisances and to the necessity of their immediate removal. Among the company was one then in full vigour and health, and who has, I regret to hear, fallen a victim of my prophecy.
And what did you predict for the future of Cleethorpes, Mr. Hitchens?
Cleethorpes possesses advantages, such as the salubrity of the sea air and the beautiful sands, sufficient to make it the Scarborough of Lincolnshire. But, from some cause, neither the health nor the pleasure of the visitors are prominently considered. People will not go again to Cleethorpes until the health of the inhabitants is better protected by a thorough drainage and by a supply of drinkable water.
Thank you, Mr. Hitchens.
Your obedient servant, sir.
Top man, and speaking of top men, the Turning Back the Tide team have identified a number of heroes who emerged out of the tragedy of the cholera outbreak. Brave local men who cared for the sick, cleansed their bodies and rooms, laid out the dead in their coffins and carried them to their graves at Old Clee Church. Men such as James Wall, John Dabb, David Dixon, Levi Stevenson, George Wardle, Joseph France, Joseph Osborne and Benjamin Coulbeck, all of whom risked their lives and some of whom lost loved ones to the cholera. In the 1854 studio now is the Reverend William Price Jones, Vicar of Old Clee, who saw it at first hand, the bravery of these men and others. Reverend, please tell us what you witnessed.
I was at home when the disease broke out, but I swiftly returned to my parishioners as soon as the news reached me. Some reports I've read suggest that the cholera did not appear until late in August. But the first deaths of two young children, 6-year-old Amos Croft and 8-month-old Thomas Coulbeck, occurred on the 17th. There were 1 or 2 deaths almost every day after that, and I officiated at the burial of most of them. However, it wasn't until the numbers falling ill escalated and visitors began to perish that the medical advisors proclaimed that all those who were able to should flee from the town. The spread of the disease was helped by the weather, which in the final week of August was hot and sultry without a breath of air, and the atmosphere seemed charged with a thick, unwholesome vapour. The cholera was largely confined to the High or Upper Thorpe, where I lodged when I first came to the area, and whilst the house facing the sea escaped the disease, it raged around the locality where stands Mr. Lill's butcher's shop and slaughterhouse, and a small court surrounded by houses known as Appleyard Square. We cannot bestow too much praise on the medical men, Messrs. Leppington, Keatley, Holland, Bell Senior and Bell Junior from Grimsby, as well as Mr. Moxon and Mr. Cooper from Hull, who worked tirelessly treating the sick, with some becoming sick themselves. Both the Bells were laid up with severe diarrhea as a consequence of their labours, but they will surely be rewarded in eternity for their sacrifices.
Indeed.
But most deserving of our gratitude and praise were the men who have already mentioned, honest working men, mainly fishermen and labourers, who went from house to house, caring for the sick and the dying with a woman's tenderness, with some paying a terrible price. Joseph Osborne was one of the last to die, a harsh reward for devoting himself with Christian charity to the sick and the dying. Benjamin Coulbeck's son was one of the first to die, and yet he applied himself admirably to helping others, and Levi Stevenson was perhaps the hardest hit of all, losing first his wife Martha and then 2 daughters, Hannah and Charlotte, all in the space of 6 days.
As a father, I can't imagine what it would be like to have to bury 1 child, let alone 2.
Then you are very fortunate, sir. Regrettably, it is a common occurrence when I have officiated at the burials of many children. Of the 60 or so people who died in the cholera outbreak, 19 of them were children. Most of them now lie in my churchyard at Old Clee, many in an unmarked mass grave. The cholera took mainly the young, the old, and the fairer sex. Far more women than men died. That is why the men were left to care for the sick and the dying. Wives and daughters who were not afflicted were sent away for their own safety.
Women and children first had a whole different meaning in 1854, didn't it? Lastly, Reverend Price Jones, could you tell us what the situation in Cleethorpes is like now?
It is a pitiable sight to see poor widows walking about, leading a little child, their only comfort, dejectedly with their heads down. I see them walking along the cliff, or sitting on the benches looking over the sea and trying to forget their bereavements over a pipe. They are both widows and widowers left alone with many children, without the means or the skills to care for them. But the sorrows of these poor are not unobserved by our Father above. We trust the evil is past, and that good is to follow, and we ask for the prayers of all on our behalf.
Thank you, Reverend Price Jones. As the Reverend mentioned, the call to evacuate Cleethorpes came well over a week after the deaths of the first victims, and when it did come, there was mass panic as visitors tried to flee the town. On what would have been Bank Holiday Monday, if bank holidays had existed in 1854, a train from Sheffield carrying 900 people arrived, as well as another from Beverley, also carrying large numbers. The disease's virulence escalated that same evening as an ideal breeding ground for cholera was created, with reports of 25 people being packed into one small house alone, whilst in another house 14 people slept in 3 beds. In Grimsby, railway officials did their best to turn back new arrivals whilst dealing with the massive influx of people who couldn't get away from Cleethorpes fast enough, some not even waiting to pack their bags. Every vehicle available was requisitioned to carry visitors to the station, and railway carriages were so crowded that many were left stranded at Grimsby until the following day. Some fell ill on the journey home and died, whilst others laid low at Cleethorpes made the journey back to Yorkshire in wooden boxes. Several visitors made it to Grimsby, but never managed to get on a train. We're now joined in the 1854 studio by Mrs. Anne Wilson from Market Raisin, who was one of the visitors in Cleethorpes at the time of the outbreak. Mrs. Wilson, could you please tell us what happened to you and your family?
I'll try. My husband Joseph, my daughter Ellen and I decided to visit Cleethorpes because his health had been deteriorating for some time, and we thought the sea air would do him good. We hadn't been there above 3 or 4 days when we were told that there was cholera in the town and we had to leave. We made it as far as Grimsby, but whilst we were waiting for the train back to Market Raisin, my poor Joseph was seized most terribly by the cholera, and despite my daughter's best efforts to nurse him, he died the same day. I barely had time to start grieving for him when Ellen was suddenly attacked by the most violent spasmodical pain, and before I knew it, she was gone too. I buried my husband on the 30th of August and my daughter on the 31st. I couldn't even bring them home with me to be buried. They're in St. James' Churchyard at Grimsby. I had to leave them there and come home alone.
It must have been terribly hard for you to bear.
It was. My daughter was only 21 years old, the youngest of my children. She came along quite late in life when I'd quite given up on having any more children. She was a lovely girl and a real blessing to me. She was engaged, you know, to a very respectable young man, and we were looking forward to seeing her married and giving us more grandchildren. But there'll be no wedding now. No future for my daughter.
I'm very sorry. And your husband?
We were married for 43 years and brought up 5 children together. He was a tailor, but he retired due to his ill health, and our son Charles took over the business. I honestly thought we were doing the right thing by taking him to Cleethorpes. But we went there for his health, and it killed him. Isn't it ironic?
Yes, Alanis Morissette has got nothing on you, Mrs. Wilson.
I'm sorry.
Forgive me. Thank you for talking to us, and please accept our condolences for your great loss. I really must remember not to include pop culture references in these interviews. Now, for every hero, there's usually a villain, and this story is no exception. Earlier, the Reverend Price Jones mentioned the butcher's shop and slaughterhouse that was the epicenter of the cholera outbreak. The shop was run by Mr. Richard Lill, and some newspaper reports of the time laid the blame squarely at his door. The Sheffield and Rotherham Independent, for example, describes a most offensive manure heap, which was a complete mass of putrid excrescences from a slaughterhouse, and although the butcher in question had often been remonstrated with, he heedlessly pursued his practice of throwing all of his filth on this heap. The result was that nearly 50 individuals perished, with the butcher in question and 2 of his family. The malaria arising from this mass of putrescence was unacceptable. It was also thought that the recent dry weather, the ground had very much cracked, and a quantity of filthy moisture drained into the neighbouring well. Unfortunately, we can't ask Mr. Lill to defend himself. He's dead. But over in our 1854 studio is one of his sons, Benjamin Lill, who also worked in the butcher's shop. Mr. Lill, what do you say to the claims that your father was to blame for the deaths of so many people?
I say it's very easy to blame a dead man for the sins of others.
Would you care to elaborate?
I certainly would. My father was a good man who worked hard to support his family. My mother died in 1841 when I was 8, and there were 7 of us children, the eldest 18 and the youngest only 5. My older sisters, Elizabeth and Harriet, kept house until they got married, and then my sister Betsy became our little housekeeper 5 years ago when she was 15. Yes, my father had his own business, but he didn't own the property. It was rented, and when I was little he tried his hand at being an innkeeper at the Cross Keys, but that only lasted a few years before he had to give it up. He also let horses and a gig to visitors so they could trot off to the Yarborough estate and neighbouring towns and villages. But it's not like we earned so much that we could go and take tea with the Earl ourselves.
So if your father wasn't to blame, then who was?
That Surgeon Leppington and others may have suggested that he get rid of the waste from the slaughterhouse, but no one ever enforced the suggestion, and it's not like we were the only ones fouling up the streets. We'd complained about the poor drainage and sewers for years, but no one listened. In their own way, both the men of power and the residents all added to the filth, and no one did anything about it. We were all to blame if anyone was.
One of the papers wrote at the time that the public would be amazed if they know how slow men of property are in providing water for their tenants. I take it that you would agree with that comment.
Some say that my father poisoned the water supply, but if there had been more wells and water pumps, this would have never have happened. There was far too many of us having to use the same pump, because even though the land and property owners charged us high rents, they were too tight-fisted to pay for clean water for their tenants.
And would it be fair to say that you're angry with the way your father's been treated by the newspapers?
You can't believe a word they say. According to them, I had a 7-year-old brother called Richard, who died as well. My older brother, Richard, died 2 years ago when he was 24. Half the names and ages in the paper were wrong. I should know. Most of them were my neighbours. I know there was a lot of confusion, and people were dying so fast it was hard to keep up. But those reporters weren't bothered about getting the facts right.
At least you didn't have phone hacking in 1854.
Phone hacking? Should I know what that is?
No, absolutely not. Forget I said it. God, when did I get so unprofessional? Lastly, Mr. Lill, what has this tragedy meant for you and your family?
What do you think? It's not like we profited from what happened. My father's dead, and so is my sister Betsy. My only comfort is that they're with my mother now in Old Clee churchyard. The gravestone said, in their lives they were loving and pleasant together, and in their death they were not divided. I'm glad they're together, but I wish they were still with me. I miss them.
Yes, thank you, Benjamin Lill, and please pass on our sympathies to the rest of your family. I wonder if newspaper men hacked the penny post back in the day. Wouldn't surprise me. Anyway, we've now heard what happened during the cholera outbreak, but what became of Cleethorpes afterwards? Well, as so often happens, it took fatalities to spur the powers that be into action, but action was taken. The filth and rubbish was removed from the streets, drainage was improved, and by the following year there were more than 30 good spring wells, rather than just a handful, supplying clean water to all. The Lincolnshire Chronicle declared that there is not probably at this time a better drained or more healthy spot than Cleethorpes in the whole kingdom, and that those who desire quietude, cleanliness and comfort will enjoy themselves more at Cleethorpes than at Scarborough. Visitors were, however, cautious in returning at first, but the lodging houses were undersubscribed during the 1855 season, but eventually Cleethorpes put the cholera behind it. When the disease made a return visit nearly 40 years later, holidaymakers cancelled their visits and a handful of people died, but it was nothing compared to the events of 1854. And what of the people we spoke to in today's edition of Turning Back the Tide? What became of them? Well, Hilliard Marshal Leppington served as a medical officer for Grimsby, No. 1 district, for more than 50 years before retiring in 1888. He died in January 1894, aged 85, having been a magistrate for many years and the mayor of Grimsby in 1860, when he laid the foundation stone for the new town hall. James Hitchin was a coroner for parts of Kesteven and Lindsay for nearly 30 years, and during that period apparently held 2,292 inquests and travelled 26,094 miles. In his resignation letter from the post in June 1867, he cited that he was afflicted by divine providence and deprived of that elasticity, mental and bodily, so essential for a faithful discharge of the requirements of the office. Eloquent to the last. William Price Jones was the vicar of Clee and Cleethorpes from 1850 to 1885. He had the vicarage built on St. Peter's Avenue in 1852 and St. Peter's Church, which opened in 1866. The first chairman of the Cleethorpes with Thrunscoe Local Board. He died in Cheltenham in 1886, aged 66. Anne Wilson moved to 12 South Street in Louth after becoming a widow. She lived out the rest of her life there with her son, widowed daughter and grandchildren, and died in 1873, aged 82. She was buried in London Road Cemetery, Louth, where there is a memorial to her husband and daughter. Benjamin Lill continued to run the butcher's shop until the 1860s before giving it up and becoming a dock labourer. He died in the Union Workhouse in March 1895, aged 62, and was buried in St. James Churchyard. Given that this is radio, I could have closed out the show in the studio, but the budget ran to one of those furry microphones and a couple of bus tickets, so here we are. And what better to finish this edition of Turning Back the Tide than in the beautiful churchyard at Old Clee, the last resting place of more than 40 of the victims of the cholera. Most people visiting this peaceful place will be unaware that as they walk by the vestry, they're traversing the graves of those poor unfortunates. Some, like Martha Broughton, Richard and Betsy Lill, Benjamin Nutley and Anne Blackburn, have marked graves nearby, but the majority lay here unacknowledged, pushing up the daffodils. The last time they caused a stir was when a drain was damaged during the digging of the mass grave, causing offensive gases to seep out into the Granthorpe family vault. Services had to be held at the school room in Cleethorpes until repairs were made. I can't help but feel that there should be some sort of memorial to them here, because through the loss of their lives, the lives of many others were saved in the future. They deserve more than a brief mention on a plaque in Wardle Street. Until the next time, thank you for listening to Turning Back the Tide with me, Piers Conservation, and may your past, present and future always exceed your expectation. Goodbye!